In ancient Greece, around 540 BCE, a metalworker named Perillos of Athens presented the tyrant Phalaris with a gift. It was a hollow bronze statue of a bull, large enough to fit a person inside. The door locked from the outside. A fire was lit beneath the belly. As the metal heated, the person inside was slowly roasted alive. But the design had one more detail. Perillos had engineered a series of tubes and stops inside the bull's head that converted the victim's cries into sounds resembling the bellowing of a real bull. The crowd outside would hear what sounded like an angry animal, not a dying person. The tyrant Phalaris ruled the city of Achragos in Sicily with absolute authority. He used the bull on political enemies, accused criminals, and anyone who threatened his power. Ancient sources describe the device being used dozens of times during his reign. The bronze turned dark with heat stains. The smell never fully left the metal. However, the most famous detail about the Brazen Bull is what happened to its inventor. According to multiple ancient historians, Phalaris asked Perillos to climb inside the bull to demonstrate how the acoustic tubes worked. Once Perillos was inside, Phalaris ordered the door sealed and the fire lit. The man who designed the instrument of torture became its first victim. Perillos was pulled out before he died, only to be thrown off a cliff. And the story does not end there. Years later, when Phalaris himself was overthrown, the people of Achragos executed him using his own bull. The device designed to protect a tyrant's power became the instrument of his death. For centuries, the most feared punishment aboard a naval warship was not the whip, the brig, or hanging from the yardarm. It was being dragged underneath the ship itself. Keelhauling was a naval punishment used primarily by the Dutch Navy during the 17th century, though records suggest it existed as early as the 8th century among Greek sailors. The process was straightforward. The condemned sailor was stripped, tied to a rope that looped beneath the hull, and thrown overboard from one side of the ship. The crew then hauled the rope from the other side, dragging the sailor underneath the vessel from one end to the other. The hull of a wooden warship was covered in barnacles, sharp-edged shellfish that attached themselves to the wood below the waterline. A single pass beneath the hull could strip the skin entirely. If the ship was large, the journey underwater lasted long enough to drown. If the ship was small, the sailor might survive the pass, only to die from infections days later. The Dutch Navy formally regulated keelhauling in their naval code, specifying it as punishment for crimes including theft, repeated drunkenness, and striking an officer. The captain decided how many passes the sailor would endure. 1 pass was considered merciful. 3 was a death sentence. However, keelhauling was not always intended to kill. In many documented cases, the rope was kept short enough that the sailor passed through quickly, suffering severe cuts but surviving. The punishment was performed in front of the entire crew. The sight of a man pulled from beneath the hull served one purpose: deterrence. No sailor who witnessed a keelhauling ever forgot it. In the basement of the Tower of London sits a wooden frame roughly 7 feet long and 3 feet wide. At each end, a set of rollers is connected to a handle. When the handle is turned, the rollers rotate in opposite directions. Ropes tied to the victim's wrists and ankles pull the body in 2 directions at once. This is the rack, and for over 300 years it was the most feared interrogation device in England. The victim was placed on the frame, arms stretched above the head, ankles bound at the opposite end. As the interrogator asked questions, an operator turned the handle. Each turn increased the tension. First the muscles tore, then the tendons separated from bone, then the joints dislocated, starting with the shoulders and hips. If the turning continued, the spine itself would begin to separate. The rack was used throughout medieval and early modern Europe, but England made it an institution. The Tower of London housed at least one rack from the 1400s through the 1600s. Guy Fawkes was racked after the Gunpowder Plot of 1605 until he could barely sign his own confession. Anne Askew, a Protestant reformer, was racked in 1546 so severely that she had to be carried to her execution because she could no longer stand. However, the rack was almost never used as a punishment. It was an interrogation tool. Its purpose was not to kill, but to extract confessions. The victim was shown the device first, given a chance to speak voluntarily. If they refused, one turn of the handle usually changed their mind. The rack did not need to destroy a body to be effective. The threat of what it could do was enough. The ancient Persians developed a method of execution so deliberately prolonged that the victim could remain alive for weeks. It was called Scaphism, from the Greek word for scooped out, and it may be the most physically repulsive punishment ever devised. The process began with two wooden boats or troughs, hollowed out and fitted together like a shell. The condemned person was stripped, placed inside, and the two halves were fastened together with the victim's head, hands, and feet protruding from the edges. The executioners then force-fed the victim a mixture of milk and honey until severe diarrhea began. The same mixture was applied to the exposed skin, particularly the eyes, ears, and feet. The boat was then set afloat on a stagnant pond. Insects arrived within hours. Flies, wasps, and beetles were drawn to the honey in the waste. They fed, laid eggs, and burrowed into the exposed and soiled flesh. Each day the victim was force-fed again to prevent death by starvation or dehydration. The goal was not to kill quickly. The goal was to keep the victim alive as long as possible while nature consumed the body from the outside in. The primary historical source is Plutarch, who described the execution of a Persian soldier named Mithridates, ordered by King Artaxerxes II around 401 BCE. According to Plutarch, Mithridates survived for 17 days. However, some modern historians question whether Scaphism was ever widely practiced. The only detailed account comes from Greek sources, not Persian ones. The Greeks had strong political reasons to portray the Persians as barbaric. Whether Scaphism was a real common punishment, or a piece of Greek propaganda designed to make an enemy look monstrous, remains an open question. What is certain is that the description alone was enough to terrify for centuries. In Imperial China, there existed a punishment reserved for the most serious crimes against the state. Treason, sedition, and the murder of one's parents were all punishable by a method the Chinese called Lingchi. In English, it translates to death by 1,000 cuts. The process was performed in public, usually in a market square. The condemned was tied to a wooden frame or post. An executioner, using a set of sharp knives, made a series of precise incisions across the body, systematically removing small pieces of flesh. The cuts followed a specific pattern, beginning with the chest and arms, progressing to the legs, and ending only when the court's ordered number of cuts had been completed. The entire process could last anywhere from 15 minutes to several hours, depending on the severity of the crime and the number of cuts specified in the sentence. Lingchi was practiced for over 1,000 years, from the Tang dynasty around the 10th century through the final years of the Qing dynasty in the early 1900s. It was formally abolished in 1905, making it one of the last forms of judicial execution of its kind to be officially ended in China. Photographs taken by French soldiers in Beijing in 1904 captured one of the final known Lingchi executions, providing the only visual record of the practice. However, these photographs reveal something unexpected. The expression on the condemned man's face appears calm, almost absent. Historians believe this is because the prisoner was given large doses of opium before the procedure began. The Chinese legal system, despite the nature of the punishment, apparently recognized the need to reduce suffering during execution. The most extreme penalty in Chinese history came with its own form of mercy, administered quietly before the first cut was made. Among the Norse sagas, one punishment stands above all others in its combination of ritual precision and deliberate cruelty. The blood eagle was reportedly performed on captured enemies of high rank, usually rival kings or the men who had killed one's father. The method, as described in the Orkneyinga saga and other Old Norse texts, followed a specific sequence. The victim was placed face down. An incision was made along both sides of the spine. The ribs were then severed from the vertebral column and pulled outward, one by one until they resembled the folded wings of an eagle. The lungs were then extracted through the opening and draped over the exposed ribs. If the victim remained silent throughout the entire procedure, they were considered to have died with honor. The most famous account describes the execution of King Ella of Northumbria by Ivar the Boneless around 867 CE. According to the sagas, Ella had captured and killed Ragnar Lothbrok by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes. When Ragnar's sons invaded England to avenge their father, they specifically demanded that Alla receive the blood eagle. The saga states that Ivar performed the ritual personally. However, many modern historians believe the blood eagle may never have happened at all. The primary descriptions come from sagas written 200 to 300 years after the events they describe. Several scholars argue that the original Old Norse text has been misinterpreted, and that the phrase carved an eagle on his back may have referred to a simple wound pattern, not a live surgical procedure. The debate continues among historians to this day, but whether the blood eagle was real or literary invention, its description achieved exactly what the Vikings needed. No enemy who heard the story ever wanted to be captured alive. In the winter of 1462, an invading Ottoman army marched into the territory of Wallachia in modern-day Romania. As they approached the capital city of Târgoviște, they encountered a sight that stopped the entire column. Stretching across the landscape for nearly a mile were an estimated 20,000 wooden stakes. On each stake was a human body. Some were Ottoman prisoners of war. Others were Wallachian criminals, political rivals, or foreign merchants who had cheated local traders. Many had been dead for months, others were still dying. The man responsible was Vlad III, ruler of Wallachia, known to history as Vlad the Impaler. Impalement, as practiced by Vlad, involved driving a large wooden stake through the body, typically entering from below and exiting through the upper back or shoulder. The stake was then planted vertically in the ground. Death was not immediate. The body's own weight caused it to slide slowly down the stake over the course of hours, sometimes days. Vlad reportedly ordered stakes of varying heights, with the tallest reserved for the highest-ranking victims. The result was a grotesque forest of the dead, arranged by social status. Historical sources estimate that Vlad impaled between 40,000 and 100,000 people during his 6-year reign. Entire villages were emptied. Ambassadors who refused to remove their hats in his presence were given permanent reminders by having the hats nailed to their skulls. However, Vlad's methods achieved exactly what he intended. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the same man who had conquered Constantinople, reportedly turned his army around after seeing the field of stakes outside Târgoviște. He declared that he could not conquer a man who was willing to do such things to his own people. Wallachia's most feared ruler became its most effective defender. The monster kept the empire at the gates. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more, or join the Discord to suggest the next topic.